My name is Brooke Simmons. I'm 28 years old, and if you've ever had someone steal something precious from you, not an object, but a piece of your soul, then maybe you'll understand where this story is going. You see, I never thought revenge would taste like rosemary and garlic chicken, but it did, and every bite was worth it. I grew up in the quiet city of Rochester, Minnesota. My parents ran a small local grocery store, the kind of place with hand-painted signs, fresh produce from neighboring farms, and cashiers who knew every customer's name. My mom used to say that food was more than sustenance. It was memory. She said flavors could anchor us to the happiest or hardest parts of our lives. I never forgot that. My love for cooking started in our tiny kitchen, standing on a stool with an oversized apron, trying not to burn the onions while my mom taught me how to fold dough with love. We didn't have much money, but there was always something delicious simmering on the stove. That was our wealth. Recipes passed down through generations, measured more by heart than by spoon. But this story isn't about my mother. It's about my aunt, Aunt Caroline. Before I go deeper into this painful chapter, I want to hear from you. Tell me your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I want to know who's walking through this story with me, because this isn't just a recipe gone wrong. It's about trust, identity, and what happens when someone you love tries to erase you. Every moment I'm sharing is real. Every word is true. And if you stay with me until the end, you'll see how I took back what was mine, and how you can too. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you believe in protecting what you've built. She was my mom's younger sister, and growing up, I always saw her as the glamorous one. She wore bold lipstick, designer heels even in winter, and had this laugh that could fill up an entire room. People admired her confidence. I did too. But behind that confidence was a kind of hunger, one that had nothing to do with food. Caroline had never liked small-town life. She used to roll her eyes at our corner store, at my mom's casseroles, at my dreams of being a chef. She said real success came from being seen, being followed, being praised by people who didn't know your last name. To her, cooking was something you did out of obligation, not love. So when she moved to Minneapolis and got into marketing, we didn't see much of her anymore. Just occasional calls on holidays, a few cold hugs when she visited, and lots of bragging about her lifestyle. But I never hated her. She was family. Years went by. I finished high school, skipped college because we couldn't afford it, and instead took every job I could find in restaurants around town. Dishwasher, hostess, prep cook, waitress. I watched. I learned. I practiced. At night, I'd come home and cook for myself. I'd tweak my grandmother's stew recipe or try to recreate dishes I saw in YouTube videos. I wasn't just cooking. I was studying flavor, movement, timing. I had a little notebook where I wrote everything down, every experiment, every reaction. And one day, I created something different, something new. It was a chicken dish, marinated in a blend of herbs and citrus, roasted until the skin crackled, and served with a sauce I'd made from scratch using caramelized onions, red wine, and a secret mix of spices I'd never seen combined before. It was the kind of meal that made you close your eyes on the first bite. That recipe became my heart. I started sharing it with close friends. They loved it. One of them said, "Brooke, this belongs in a restaurant." I smiled. I had no money, no investors, no culinary degree, but I had the dream. A year later, Aunt Caroline showed up in Rochester unexpectedly. She said she was reconnecting with her roots. We welcomed her, of course. She looked around the store with that same judgmental glance. But when I offered to cook dinner that night, she shrugged and said, "Sure, surprise me." So I made my chicken. She took one bite, then another. Then she went silent. I remember her staring at the plate with narrowed eyes and licking her fingers like she didn't even realize she was doing it. She didn't say thank you, didn't compliment the dish. But later that night, I saw her take a photo of the leftovers in the fridge. I didn't think much of it. Maybe she wanted to remember it. Maybe she finally appreciated something I made. 2 months later, everything changed. My best friend texted me a link with the message, "Isn't this your dish?" The link was to an Instagram page, Caroline's new food blog. She was promoting herself as a culinary entrepreneur, a self-taught visionary, sharing personal recipes from the heart. And right there, front and center, was my chicken, my photo, my description, even my garnishing style. The caption read, "Inspired by old family traditions, my personal twist on the dish that started it all." Get the full recipe on my website. Original recipe, Chef Caroline. I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. My hands shook. My chest felt hollow. I wasn't angry, at least not at first. I was hurt. She could have asked. She could have credited me. She could have shown a shred of respect for what that dish meant to me. But no, she stole it, branded it, claimed it as her origin story. And the worst part? People loved it. She went viral. Midwestern culinary genius, they called her. Food critics reposted her reels. TV channels invited her for guest appearances. In less than a year, she had sponsors, pop-ups, and a book deal, all built on my recipe. I tried confronting her once. I called and asked why she did it. Her answer was simple. "Brooke, it's just chicken. Relax. If it were really yours, you would have done something with it already." That's when something inside me snapped. She was right about one thing. I hadn't done anything with it. Yet. But that was about to change. I made a decision that night. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't beg. I wouldn't post online crying for attention or justice. I'd do what I always did, cook. And this time, I'd make sure no one ever stole from me again. So I went to work. I saved every dollar I earned from double shifts at a downtown bistro. I sold old furniture. I built a business plan using free templates from the library. And I paid a local attorney, an older woman named Margaret who used to eat at my family's store, every penny I had to help me do one thing, trademark my recipe. Not just the dish, but the entire concept, presentation, name, flavor profile, everything. It took months. But when the certificate came in the mail, I stared at it for a long time. It felt like armor. It felt like a promise. But I didn't stop there. I started hosting underground dinners in my small apartment. Word spread. Friends brought friends. Strangers showed up with wine and stories. Every night I served the same meal, my chicken, and people began asking the same question, "When are you opening your restaurant?" That was when I knew. The dream wasn't just alive, it was growing, and Caroline had no idea what was coming. I sold my car to cover the deposit on a small, rundown storefront on the edge of downtown Rochester. It wasn't much. Cracked tiles, peeling paint, a sink that gurgled like it was choking. But it had a working oven, a wide window facing the street, and just enough charm for me to see what it could become. I called it Root and Flame. The name was personal. Root for where I came from, Flame for what I'd been through. Everything about it was mine. No investors, no help, just savings, sweat, and a quiet, simmering fire in my chest that I refused to let burn out. I worked 15-hour days, sanding countertops, repainting walls, fixing what I could with tutorials and sheer will. At night, I collapsed on a futon in the back room, exhausted but buzzing with purpose. I'd never felt more alive. It was as if every insult, every ignored dream, every stolen moment had been building toward this. I wasn't just opening a restaurant, I was reclaiming my voice. Word got out faster than I expected. People remembered my pop-up dinners and brought their friends. A local food blogger stumbled in one rainy afternoon, took one bite of my signature dish, and posted, "The best chicken in the Midwest." And I'm not exaggerating. Overnight, the post exploded. Customers started lining up. The dish I had once guarded with trembling hands now came out of my kitchen in waves, each plate a silent declaration of ownership. Then, Caroline showed up. I recognized her even before she entered. That expensive coat, those pointed boots, the sunglasses that somehow still screamed for attention. She walked in like she owned the place, like she was gracing my walls with her presence. She glanced around the room slowly, and when her eyes landed on me behind the counter, she smiled. But it wasn't a warm smile. It was tight, calculated. "I see you've been busy," she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. I wiped my hands on my apron, met her gaze. "Just doing what I love. Like you taught me, right?" She let out a short laugh, glanced at the menu board. "Cute name. And look at that. You're still cooking that chicken. People must really like it." I leaned in slightly, just enough so only she could hear. "They like it because it's mine." She blinked. Just once. But I saw it. The twitch in her jaw. the subtle shift of her weight. Her confidence cracked for a second. "Well," she said quickly, "I just wanted to see it for myself. I'm doing a spread for my book, Midwest Women in Food. Might even mention you. I already trademarked the recipe," I said before she could turn away. "And the presentation. And the name. Just in case your memory got fuzzy." She froze. Her expression didn't change, but her hand gripped her bag tighter. "Of course you did," she said coolly. "Smart girl." She left without ordering anything, but I knew that wasn't the end. The next week, I received a cease and desist letter. The envelope was thick, embossed, official. The letter accused me of infringing on intellectual property associated with Caroline's established brand. According to her lawyer, my dish was her creation, and I was riding on her fame. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I took the letter straight to Margaret, my attorney. She read it calmly, then looked up and smiled. "This is desperation," she said. "And frankly, you've got her cornered. You trademarked everything before she did. Her claim is baseless." We responded with documentation, photos, recipe logs, dates of my underground dinners, screenshots of text messages between me and friends where I described the recipe long before Caroline's blog even existed. Every line was another nail in the coffin of her lie. But Caroline wasn't done. She started publicly dragging me on her social media accounts. Not by name, she was too clever for that, but with captions like, "Isn't it funny how some people can only rise by imitating others?" Or, "Originality can't be trademarked. Soul can't be stolen." Her followers, loyal and loud, flooded her comments with praise. Some of them even found my page and left insults. Copycat, desperate clout chaser, jealous niece. I muted the notifications. I poured all my energy into Root and Flame. I added 2 new dishes to the menu, recipes I had been saving, each more personal than the last. One was a stew inspired by my father's Sunday tradition. The other, a dessert my mom used to make with cinnamon and honey, wrapped in paper-thin dough and served warm. The reviews were glowing, but I wasn't just building a restaurant anymore. I was building a wall, one so tall that Caroline couldn't scale it no matter how loudly she screamed from the outside. Then came the food festival. It was an annual event in Minneapolis, the kind that drew chefs from every corner of the state. This year, they were doing a Heartland Heritage theme, celebrating recipes rooted in family tradition. One of my customers nominated Root and Flame. I almost declined. Too much attention, too close to Caroline's turf. But something inside me said to go. Not for her, for me. I brought my chicken. Not the modified version, not a dressed-up reinvention. The original. The one I made that first night when Caroline said, "Surprise me." The one she stole. Our booth was modest. Wooden signs, fresh herbs in jars, cloth napkins instead of plastic. I served every plate with quiet confidence, explaining the story behind the recipe to anyone who asked. People listened. They smiled. They returned for seconds. By mid-afternoon, a crowd had formed. I saw her before she saw me. Caroline, striding in with a camera crew and a team of assistants, dressed in branded chef whites that looked like they'd never touched oil. She was making rounds, filming content, laughing for the cameras. When she reached my booth, she stopped short. And then, she smiled that smile again. "Well, well," she said, motioning to her cameraman to keep rolling. "Look who made it out of the kitchen." I stayed calm. "Would you like a plate?" "On the house." She took one, holding it awkwardly for the camera. I could see the recognition in her eyes with the first bite. She knew what it was. And so did everyone around her. The local news anchor hosting the event approached us. "Chef Caroline, we've heard you tell this story before. How this recipe came from your own family heritage. But I just spoke with Brooke Simmons here, and she says this was her personal creation. How do you respond to that?" The moment stretched. Caroline's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked from the plate to the camera, then back to me. The silence was louder than any insult she'd ever thrown my way. Finally, she spoke. "Everyone is inspired by someone," she said, voice tight. "Family recipes are complicated." The reporter nodded politely but moved on. And just like that, the lie began to unravel. 2 weeks later, a food blog posted an exposé. Whose recipe was it really? They cited timestamps, quotes from my friends, legal records. Caroline's credibility cracked like glass. Sponsors dropped her. TV shows canceled her appearances. Her book release was postponed indefinitely. Meanwhile, Root and Flame had a waiting list for Friday nights. One evening, after the dinner rush, I sat alone at the front table, watching the lights of downtown Rochester flicker through the window. My hands still smelled like garlic. My feet ached. But my heart was finally still. I had taken the thing that nearly broke me and turned it into something unshakable. She tried to erase me, but I wrote myself back in, with fire. Oh, ChatGPT DC. A month after the festival, I received an invitation I almost thought was a mistake. It was from the Heartland Culinary Council, a regional group known for championing authenticity in food. They wanted me to speak at their annual gathering, not just as a featured chef, but as a keynote speaker. The theme this year? Truth, taste, and taking back the narrative. I stared at the email for a long time before responding. It felt like the kind of full-circle moment you see in movies. I wasn't just being recognized for my recipe. I was being asked to tell my story, my real story. When the night came, I stood on stage in a modest black dress, my name printed on a folded placard at the podium. There were hundreds of people in the room, chefs, students, critics, local farmers. As I stepped up to speak, I felt my knees tremble, but I took a deep breath and remembered the way my mother used to calm me down as a child. When your voice shakes, it means the truth is coming out. I told them everything, about how my love for food began, how my aunt had taken something that meant everything to me, how I fought silently to reclaim it. I told them about the night I trademarked the recipe, about the cease and desist, about the food festival where the truth finally surfaced. And then I said something I hadn't planned on saying. I used to think revenge was fire, destructive, angry, but it's not. Not always. Sometimes revenge is patience, persistence. Sometimes it's a dish served not cold, but with purpose. When I stepped off stage, the applause was thunderous. Strangers shook my hand. A woman hugged me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "Thank you for standing up for all of us who've been silenced." I went home that night feeling lighter than I had in years. But just as quickly, life reminded me that peace rarely lasts long. The next morning, I walked into the restaurant and found a rock shattered through the front window. There was glass everywhere, and a note, handwritten on cheap-lined paper, sitting on the floor near the counter. It read, "Stay in your lane." There were no signatures. No cameras caught the act. But I didn't need proof to know who had orchestrated it. Caroline had gone silent publicly. But this wasn't just coincidence. She was unraveling. I could feel it. I filed a police report, replaced the window, and added a security system. But something inside me shifted. I wasn't just defending a dish anymore. I was defending everything I had built. The restaurant, my name, my family's legacy. And I realized something important. This wasn't over. Not yet. A few weeks later, a former assistant of Caroline's reached out. Her name was Denise, and she had left Caroline's team after the festival. She asked to meet at a nearby cafe. She looked nervous when I arrived, stirring her tea with restless fingers. Then she pulled out her phone and showed me a folder of emails. "I couldn't do it anymore," she said. "I thought you should see these." The emails were damning. They showed that Caroline had not only stolen my recipe, but had gone out of her way to destroy my credibility before I ever opened the restaurant. She had tried to buy the domain rootandflame.com a week before my launch. She'd contacted sponsors pretending to be a concerned patron, claiming I was using copyrighted material. She even forwarded my underground dinner photos to brands, framing them as stolen. I felt the room tilt as I read. I had known she resented me. I hadn't known she feared me. That fear had turned into sabotage. "Why are you showing me this now?" I asked. "Because she's trying to make a comeback," Denise said. "She's been shopping a new cookbook under a different name. Same recipes, reworded. She thinks if she rebrands, people will forget." I thanked her, made copies of everything, and walked out of that cafe with one goal in mind: make sure no one ever forgot what she did. I called Margaret. We compiled a new legal file, updated with the sabotage, the attempted fraud, and evidence of ongoing defamation. This wasn't just about ownership anymore. This was about reputation, ethics, and the dangerous game of manipulation. We filed a lawsuit. The announcement hit the local news. Then the food blogs picked it up. And soon after, national culinary magazines ran headlines like, "From recipe theft to legal reckoning, one chef's fight for justice." Caroline responded with a press release full of denials and vague statements about family misunderstandings. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. Her past fans began unfollowing her. Her new brand stalled before it ever launched. The day we entered the courtroom, I wore a dark blazer, hair pulled back, face calm. She wore white. I don't know if it was symbolic or just her usual attempt to look unbothered, but the cracks showed. She couldn't meet my eyes. The trial lasted 5 days. We presented the emails, the timestamps, the trademark documents. We played the video clip from the festival where she hesitated under the pressure of the truth. Her team tried to claim the recipe was inspired by shared family culture, but when pressed, Caroline couldn't produce a single written or recorded version of the dish that predated mine. On the final day, I was asked to testify. I stood up, looked at the judge, and said, "She didn't just take my recipe. She took my voice, my story, my identity, and I had to fight to take it back." We won. The court ruled in my favor on all counts: intellectual property, defamation, attempted sabotage. Caroline was ordered to pay damages and issue a public apology. She did it, reluctantly, on a dimly lit video with a voice that sounded nothing like regret. But it didn't matter. The apology wasn't for her. It was for everyone watching, for every underdog, every artist, every dreamer who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or stolen from. After the case closed, I hosted a free dinner at Root and Flame. I invited the local community, friends, staff, and even Denise. We served the chicken dish that started it all, free for every table. When people asked why, I said, "Because this isn't just a recipe, it's a reclaiming." That night, as I watched people laugh, eat, and lean into each other with warmth, I finally let myself breathe. I had walked through the fire, and I had come out not burned, but reborn. Caroline disappeared from the public eye soon after. Last I heard, she moved to a smaller town in another state. She was still trying to sell her new brand, but the food world had already moved on. They remembered the truth, and so did I. After the lawsuit ended and Caroline faded from the public eye, life at Root and Flame began to settle into something close to harmony. Not quiet, because restaurants never are, but rhythmic, predictable in the best kind of way. The buzz of conversation during the dinner rush, the sharp clatter of pans in the kitchen, the hum of the espresso machine in the morning. It was a kind of music I'd waited my whole life to hear. I wasn't chasing something anymore. I was living it. But peace isn't the absence of problems. It's the presence of purpose. And after the storm I had survived, I found myself reevaluating everything, not out of fear, but from a place of deeper awareness. Who was I, now that I had reclaimed what was mine? Who was I, when the anger had cooled and the flames of revenge had done their work? At first, I tried to keep things exactly as they were. I kept my head down and focused on consistency. Same menu, same vibe, same goals. But deep inside, something nudged me forward. The dish that had once defined my story had become almost too familiar. I loved it still, but I knew that if I wanted to keep growing, I had to let myself explore again. Reinvention wasn't betrayal. It was evolution. One evening, long after the last table had cleared, I found myself standing in the kitchen with a blank notebook and a single thought. What if the story wasn't over? What if it was just changing chapters? So I started creating again. This time not from pain, not from a place of proving anyone wrong, but from freedom. I revisited old family recipes, experimented with flavors from other cultures, took inspiration from the very people who now sat at my tables. One customer brought me saffron from her trip to Spain. Another gifted me a jar of preserved lemons from her grandmother's pantry in Morocco. Every gift became a piece of a new creation. I introduced seasonal dishes: a roasted beet salad with goat cheese mousse and walnut vinaigrette, a ginger-laced pumpkin soup with toasted pepitas, a hand-cut pasta served in a broth infused with garlic, wine, and sun-dried tomatoes. They weren't just recipes. They were stories written in flavor. People noticed. the local newspaper ran a feature titled Root and Flame, the Phoenix of Rochester. They praised the emotional depth of the dishes, the way the menu reflected a journey more personal than any brand could fabricate. And for the first time in a long while, I felt proud not just for surviving, but for growing beyond the pain. But growth doesn't come without its own battles. Running a restaurant is a living thing. Staff come and go. Suppliers falter. Health inspections pop up. And underneath it all, I carried a quiet fear that one misstep could unravel everything. It was hard to admit, even to myself, but I sometimes felt like I was holding it all together with thread. What if I let someone down? What if the story people loved about me became the cage that kept me from moving forward? I talked to Margaret one night, not as my attorney, but as the friend she had become. I feel like people come here because of what I went through, I told her. Like they want to support me because I was the underdog. But what if I'm not that anymore? What if I stop being the woman who won the lawsuit and start just being a regular chef? She smiled gently. That's the goal, Brooke. To become more than your trauma. To be known for what you build, not just what you survived. Her words stayed with me, so I made a decision. I began mentoring. I started a small internship program for local high school students interested in culinary arts. Most of them had never set foot in a professional kitchen. They were raw, awkward, unsure. But I saw myself in every single one of them. The girl who once thought her dreams were too expensive to pursue. The girl who thought success belonged only to the loud, the glamorous, the connected. Every week I set aside time to teach them, not just recipes, but business, branding, resilience. I told them how important it was to document their creations, to protect their work, to know their worth. I told them the story of the chicken dish, not to brag, to warn, to inspire. One girl, Layla, was 17 and barely spoke the first few weeks. But she took notes obsessively, stayed late to mop floors without being asked, and brought her own spices from home. One night, I asked her to create a dessert for the staff meal. She hesitated, then quietly placed a tray of coconut cardamom rice pudding on the prep table. The first bite nearly made me cry. It wasn't just good, it was unforgettable. She looked at me with wide eyes. Do you like it? I love it, I said. And now we write it down, and you put your name on it. Moments like that became the new heartbeat of Root and Flame. Of course, not everyone liked the change. Some customers missed the original simplicity. Others questioned why the menu shifted so frequently. But most stayed. Most understood. And more importantly, I had made peace with the ones who didn't. One rainy afternoon, I received a letter. Not an email. An actual letter. The envelope was thick, the handwriting familiar. It was from Caroline. She wrote from a small town in Oregon, said she had started over. New name, new job, no more culinary empire dreams. She admitted to everything, said the lawsuit had broken her public image, but the shame had finally broken something deeper, her ego. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She said she didn't deserve it, but she wanted me to know she was sorry, truly sorry. I sat with the letter for a long time. I didn't write back. Not because I hated her. I didn't. I had moved past that. But because the closure I needed hadn't come from her, it had come from inside me, from every meal I had served, every night I had stayed open, every time I stood my ground with grace instead of fury. Revenge had brought justice, but growth brought peace. I looked around the restaurant that night, at the string lights that cast a soft glow on the walls, at the laughter rising from a table near the window, at the plate of Layla's pudding being served to a curious couple on their first date. And I realized something else. I had become what I used to dream of, not in headlines or viral posts, but in something far more real. I had become the kind of woman who didn't just feed people, she lifted them. Winter came to Rochester with an early chill that clung to the sidewalks and turned the windows of Root and Flame into foggy canvases. Inside, though, the restaurant was alive, warm, glowing, full of noise and movement. It was a Friday evening, and the place was at capacity. The smell of rosemary, butter, and roasted squash floated through the air. I moved between the kitchen and the front of house with ease, checking in with tables, helping plate dishes, and offering the occasional hug to a regular who'd been coming since the beginning. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But beneath the surface, something was brewing again. Something I hadn't seen coming. It started as whispers. A new pop-up restaurant had opened on the edge of Minneapolis, marketed as a heritage kitchen experience. The chef remained anonymous at first, drawing in curious food lovers with Instagram photos of stunning dishes and poetic captions about authenticity and rediscovery. It didn't take long for one of my former interns, now in culinary school, to message me. She sent me a post with a single sentence. "I think it's her." I clicked the link. The presentation was different, sleeker, but the bones were unmistakable. A chicken dish, plated with the same balance of rustic and refined that I had poured myself into years ago. The caption read, "From my grandmother's table to yours." My stomach dropped. Caroline had rebranded herself. Again. This time she had gone to lengths to disguise the comeback. A new name, a new city, no face tied to the restaurant. It was all mystery and elegance until the reviews came out. One called the chef a phoenix in the shadows. Another praised her for bringing old family recipes into a new light. Then came the interviews. She was careful with her words, avoiding the past directly. But the narrative was clear. A woman returning from a fall, stronger, wiser, more creative than ever. She had learned from her mistakes. Not morally, but strategically. I stood in my office, rereading an interview where she said, "We all have origin stories. Sometimes they're painful, but pain is the mother of innovation." I felt something tighten in my chest, not just anger, but disbelief. She was doing it again, and this time she wasn't stealing a dish. She was stealing the redemption arc. I had a choice to make. I could let it go. I had already won, legally and morally. My restaurant was thriving. My reputation was solid. But the deeper truth was, she hadn't stopped trying to rewrite history. And silence, again, would be complicity. I reached out to Denise, her former assistant, who had since become a friend. She was hesitant at first, but agreed to look into the pop-up. Within days, she confirmed what I already suspected. Caroline was using a shell company and operating under a culinary alias, one that conveniently distanced her from the damage she'd caused. She had no intention of owning up to the past. She just wanted to profit from its ashes. I didn't want to drag it all back into the spotlight. The press, the drama, the online noise. But I also knew I couldn't let it slide. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about truth, about accountability, about ensuring that the younger chefs watching this story unfold learned the right lesson. That reinvention without restitution is just another form of theft. I called Margaret and laid everything out. She was calm, methodical, and, as always, brutally honest. "You have two paths," she said. "One is quiet, the other is loud. But only one protects your legacy." I chose loud. We gathered the evidence, photos, receipts, audio snippets from interviews, social media trails, testimony from industry contacts who recognized her. I didn't want to sue this time. I wanted exposure, not for revenge, but for clarity. So I partnered with a respected food journalist who had covered our original story. I gave her everything: the truth, the timeline, the receipts. The article dropped on a Monday morning with the headline, "Rebranding or Repeating? The Hidden Face Behind Minneapolis's Newest Pop-Up." The impact was instant. The food community reacted with outrage. Chefs I admired shared the article with comments like, "Integrity matters," and "We remember the first story." Former fans of Caroline, those who had once defended her, now turned away, tired of the deception. Sponsors backed out. Venues canceled her appearances. And the mystery around her new persona unraveled in real time. But the most unexpected fallout came from my customers. That week, people poured into Root and Flame, not just to eat, but to thank me. They left notes on napkins. "Thanks for standing up. Truth always wins. You didn't just feed us, you taught us." I had never felt more seen. One afternoon, Layla came into my office holding a new dessert sample. Her hands were shaking slightly, but her voice was strong. "I was scared to show you this," she said. "It's new, and I wanted it to be perfect. But then I remembered what you said, to be proud of what we create, even if someone else tries to take it." The dessert was stunning. A layered mousse with basil-infused chocolate and a delicate orange glaze. I tasted it and smiled. "We're putting it on the menu this week," I told her. That night, I stayed at the restaurant long after closing. The lights dimmed, the chairs stacked, the kitchen quiet. I walked through the dining area, fingers grazing the tops of tables, remembering how it all began. One recipe, one betrayal, one refusal to stay silent. I stepped outside and looked up at the cold Minnesota sky, stars faint behind the winter clouds. I thought about my mother, her quiet strength, about the grocery store where it all began, about the stove where I learned to taste before I measured. I thought about Caroline, and I didn't feel hate. I didn't feel pity. I just felt done. She had tried to rewrite the ending. But the thing about stories is, truth echoes. No matter how many masks you wear, the truth finds its way back. And mine had. Not in a courtroom, not in a headline, but in every meal served with care, every intern who left stronger, every guest who tasted something real. Revenge wasn't the climax of my story. It was just the spark. Root and Flame celebrated its 3rd anniversary on a cold Sunday afternoon in March. Snow still clung to the edges of the sidewalk, but the warmth inside the restaurant defied the season. We closed for regular service that day, and instead hosted a community dinner. No reservations, no prices, just food and stories. It was my way of saying thank you to the city that had embraced me, believed me, and stood beside me even when things got messy. I stood near the back, watching from a quiet corner as couples toasted with glasses of mulled wine, parents laughed with children over handmade pasta, and strangers passed plates like they'd known each other for years. It didn't feel like a restaurant anymore. It felt like home, a place stitched together by perseverance, memory, and food that meant something. A woman approached me with a smile. She was older, maybe in her 60s, with gray curls and kind eyes. She placed her hand on mine and said, "You remind me of my mother. She cooked like her recipes held secrets. Thank you for keeping that spirit alive." I felt something shift in me as she walked away, a kind of peace I hadn't felt in years. For so long, I had operated with tension buried beneath the surface, a constant hum of defense, alertness, readiness to fight back. But standing in that room, I realized I didn't feel it anymore. The edges inside me had softened. I wasn't at war. I was at rest. In the weeks that followed, life moved forward gently but firmly. We expanded our weekend brunch hours, added new staff, and even began construction on a private event space next door. I worked closely with Layla, who now ran the kitchen during lunch shifts and had earned the title of sous chef. Her dishes carried a depth that made people pause mid-bite. I could see myself in her. Not just the girl I used to be, but the woman I had become. Resilient, precise, fiercely protective of her craft. One morning, I arrived early and found her standing at the prep table, arms crossed, looking at a menu draft she had written by hand. I didn't interrupt. I just watched as she stared at her words like they meant the world, because I knew they did. That menu wasn't just paper. It was her voice, her story. When she noticed me, she smiled nervously. "Do you think it's ready?" I nodded. "It's more than ready. Just make sure you save the original. Always keep your first copy." She laughed, but I could tell she understood. The weight of that advice settled into her shoulders like a cloak she was proud to wear. Around the same time, I was invited to speak at a culinary institute in Minneapolis. The irony didn't escape me. It was the same city where Caroline had tried to reinvent herself. I hesitated for a moment when I received the invitation. Not because of her. I hadn't heard anything about her in months. But because part of me still carried scars from that place. But wounds, I had learned, didn't need to remain open. Some could be worn like medals, proof that healing had happened. So I went. The auditorium was full of students, wide-eyed and hungry for possibility. I told them about the value of persistence, about the difference between ambition and greed, about the responsibility that came with feeding others. I told them the story, my story, but not with bitterness. I told it as a lesson, one they could carry with them as armor. When I finished, one of the professors asked a question from the back. If you could go back and change anything, what would it be? I didn't need time to think. Nothing, I said, because even in the worst moments, I was becoming someone I didn't yet understand. The pain shaped me, but I chose what stayed, and I chose to keep the strength. The room fell quiet. And then came the applause. Not loud or chaotic, but steady, honest. That night, I drove home under a quiet sky, feeling more certain of myself than I ever had. The road that had once felt like a battleground now felt like a bridge. I wasn't running anymore. I was walking forward. Back in Rochester, life continued to evolve. We launched a cookbook, Rooted in Flame, recipes that tell the truth. It wasn't flashy or filled with glossy marketing. It was personal. Every recipe came with a story, written in my own voice, sometimes messy, sometimes poetic, always honest. Layla contributed 2 recipes. Margaret wrote the foreword. The book sold better than I expected, not because it was trendy, but because it was real. People were tired of perfect facades. They wanted something that spoke to the grit behind the beauty. One afternoon, as I signed copies at a small bookstore, a woman stood at the end of the line, holding a copy to her chest like it might vanish. When she reached me, she whispered, "I read your story in a hospital waiting room while my daughter was in surgery. It gave me strength. It reminded me to fight." I didn't know what to say. I just held her hand and let the silence speak for both of us. Later that year, we hosted our first Root and Flame retreat, a weekend workshop for aspiring chefs to cook, share, and reconnect with why they began. It wasn't just about skills, it was about soul. We spent evenings by the fire, telling stories, crying over failed recipes and lost parents and broken friendships, laughing over ridiculous kitchen mishaps. It was everything I had hoped to create. Not a brand, a movement. And then one day, I woke up to an email. No name, no subject, just a single sentence. "I'm glad you kept going." I didn't know who sent it. Maybe it was Caroline. Maybe it was someone else entirely, but I smiled anyway, because I had kept going, and I wasn't done. Root and Flame wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a legacy, a space where mistakes could be acknowledged, where voices couldn't be stolen, where every dish had a fingerprint and a heartbeat, where healing happened quietly, one bite at a time. The girl who once cooked in a cramped kitchen for people who didn't see her worth was now the woman who fed hundreds, who mentored, who protected, who taught others that what we create with love should never be taken without consent. And so, I kept showing up, every day, with flour on my hands and fire in my chest. Because this wasn't just about food, it was about truth. 3 years later, Root and Flame stood stronger than ever, not just as a restaurant, but as a living story, written with every plate, every guest, every flame that touched the skillet. The building itself had grown. What was once a modest dining room had expanded to include a teaching kitchen, a quiet reading corner with shelves of cookbooks and journals, and a sunlit back patio that bloomed with herbs in spring and turned golden with falling leaves in autumn. What I had built wasn't just a business. It was a reflection of everything I had fought to reclaim, reimagine, and release. I had learned that healing wasn't a finish line you crossed. It was a series of small choices. Every day you decide to show up, to stay open, to create something even when the world has told you not to. My past didn't disappear, but it softened. The sharp edges dulled. What once consumed me now felt like something I could place on a shelf, acknowledge with gratitude, and move past. The interns I once mentored had become staff, leaders, and collaborators. Layla, now in her mid-20s, ran our evening service. Her name appeared on the menu beside mine, our dishes marked with tiny stars to indicate who had created them. Guests asked for her by name. Food writers mentioned her with reverence. And sometimes I'd catch her in the kitchen late at night, humming softly as she stirred a reduction or folded pastry dough, completely unaware that she had become the woman she once idolized. We had started something new, the Story Spoon Project. It was a program where we collected handwritten recipes from guests, meals that reminded them of home, of lost loved ones, of their own personal triumphs, and we recreated them in our test kitchen. Once a month, we'd select one and feature it as a guest dish, honoring the story behind it. The person who submitted it would join us for a meal, watching others savor the food that had shaped them. Some cried, some laughed, all of them left lighter. One evening, a young man named Marco submitted his grandmother's tomato soup. It seemed simple, even ordinary, but when we cooked it exactly as he described, simmered low for 3 hours with a touch of cinnamon and a final swirl of cream. It was magic. He sat at the corner table, tears running down his face as he whispered, "She used to serve this every Friday. I haven't tasted it since she passed. This feels like being hugged." That's what it had become. This wasn't a revenge story anymore. This was a restoration story, and it belonged to more than just me. Occasionally, people still asked about Caroline. Her name popped up in interviews, sometimes in whispers in the food community. I had heard that she tried to launch a blog again under yet another alias, but it never took off. The industry had moved on. Her time had passed not because she lacked talent, but because she had burned the bridge of trust too many times to ever build something real again. I didn't speak about her often anymore. When I did, it wasn't with venom. I told the truth, but I didn't dwell. There was no need. The justice had already happened. Not in courtrooms, not in headlines, but in every single moment I refused to be small. On the 5th anniversary of Root and Flame, we hosted our biggest event yet, a community gathering called Flavors of Belonging. Chefs from all over Minnesota joined us to prepare dishes rooted in family history, lost recipes, and long-held secrets. The patio was lit with hundreds of candles, and soft music floated in the background. Guests moved through the space like it was a garden of stories. I took the mic just before dessert. I hadn't planned to speak, but the emotion in the air called for it. "I started this place with one dish," I said. "A dish someone once tried to take from me, but they couldn't take the memory. They couldn't take the truth. And from that truth, I found something even bigger. I found you. I found this." I looked around at the faces, some familiar, some new, and continued. "We are not defined by what is stolen from us. We are defined by what we choose to rebuild in its place. So tonight, let's not talk about loss. Let's talk about flavor, about the courage it takes to taste your own story and still say, 'I'm proud.'" The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was steady, heartfelt, and it filled the space like a warm wind. After the event, I walked through the empty kitchen, the scent of baked figs and cinnamon lingering in the air. I thought of my mother, my father, the grocery store that started it all. I thought of that first night I cooked the chicken dish that changed everything, and how terrified I had been to let anyone else taste it. How that fear had turned into fire, and how that fire had shaped something beautiful. A few weeks later, I was invited to contribute to a national food anthology. The theme was Resilience in the Kitchen. I submitted a story titled The Dish That Fought Back. In it, I wrote not just about Caroline, but about myself, the younger me, the one who doubted, who hesitated, who almost gave up. I wrote about how she found her voice through heat and salt and cracked ceramic plates, and how, in learning to defend her creation, she ended up defending something much greater, her sense of self. The anthology went on to win awards. I didn't attend the ceremonies. I didn't need to. My reward was already plated every night, steaming and fragrant, passed from hand to hand with reverence. One spring morning, I received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a recipe card, no note, just a title at the top, Brooke's Fire-Roasted Chicken, and the original steps, exactly as I had written them in my first recipe journal years ago. It was my handwriting. The card had been photocopied and shared at some point, but now it had returned to me, anonymously, like a full circle folded into paper. I framed it and hung it in the back kitchen, where only the staff could see it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even when your words are stolen, even when your fire is threatened, the truth waits. It always finds its way home. Root and Flame expanded again the following year. We opened a second location in Duluth, this time led entirely by Layla and two of our former interns. I visited on opening day, stood quietly in the back as they moved like poetry through the space. The menu was theirs, the flavors were theirs, but the heartbeat, I recognized that rhythm. As I stood beneath the soft glow of the pendant lights, watching customers sip wine and share plates, I knew. My story didn't end with revenge. It didn't end with success. It didn't even end here. Because stories like mine don't end. They feed the next. They become legacy. Have you ever had someone take credit for something you poured your heart into? Share your experience in the comments. If this story moved you, Please like the video and subscribe for more real stories of perseverance, healing, and truth. You never know who might need to hear this. Sometimes the best kind of revenge isn't loud. It's quiet, steady, and deeply fulfilling. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember, your voice, your work, and your truth deserve to be protected. Always.